It had rained the morning she made her choice. Not the dramatic kind of thunderous downpour that might later be recounted as symbolic in some epic tale of lost love, but a soft, hesitant drizzle, as if the sky itself were uncertain. Allie stood by the window of her room at the Windsor plantation, fingers resting on the glass, watching the mist settle gently over the garden hedges. Her suitcase sat open on the bed behind her, a neat array of folded blouses and silk stockings tucked alongside the perfume she never wore but always packed. Her mother's voice had drifted in earlier, calm and coaxing, like a hand smoothing the wrinkles of a stubborn dress. Lon was waiting in town, just as promised. Reliable, polished, composed. The kind of man who could be counted on to remain standing when the storm came. She thought of Noah, his house by the river, the way his hands trembled slightly when they cupped her face, as if he too were always surprised she had come back. But the dream had lived its time. She had walked barefoot with him under the stars, danced in kitchens, touched the ghosts of years that had almost faded. But now they loomed too large. The memories were not strong enough to hold up a life. They would tear under the weight of taxes, laundry, the dull repetition of days. And so she turned from the window, zipped the suitcase, and walked away from the story they had written. In summer ink. Noah waited by the dock that afternoon. He did not know yet that the letter he had written every day for a year had not been enough. That the old White House he rebuilt with trembling hands and broken hope would stand as a monument to something finished. He watched the road until the sun bled into the trees and the breeze cooled the heat of his skin. When darkness fell and the silence solidified, he knew she was not coming. There were no tears, no fists hurled toward the sky. Just a breath, long and low, that left his body as if it carried something out with it. He stayed until the frogs began to sing and the stars turned their backs. Allie married Lon in the spring, under a canopy of magnolia blossoms and camera flashes. Her dress trailed the polished floor of her parents' estate, and her smile was the one she had practiced. In mirrors, polite and practiced. Lon's hand was firm in hers, his vows steady. He spoke of forever, of safety, of futures built like bridges. And Allie nodded, because it was what she was supposed to do. Because it felt, if not like flying, at least like not falling. The years unfolded like linen tablecloths, crisp and quiet. Allie moved into a townhouse in Charleston with high ceilings and long shadows. She taught art at a private school and painted less and less as time went on. The canvases stacked in the attic never quite dried. She smiled at the right parties, raised 2 children who inherited Lon's discipline and her eyes. There were weekends at the lake, winters in Aspen, conversations over wine and lamb where no one spoke of what-ifs. Lon rose in the world of law, like a man pulled upward by ropes tied to invisible hands. Allie watched him sometimes from across rooms, his head bent toward clients, his laugh placed perfectly between charm and command. She never told him about Noah. Not because of shame, because some things are not meant to be shared. They are meant to be buried so deep, they feed the roots of something else entirely. Noah kept to the house. After a time, he stopped telling people why he built it. He no longer gave tours to passersby, or smiled when they pointed at the wrapped porch and whispered about love. He grew quiet, his hands calloused with the routines of repair. The house needed him in the same way a body needs breath. It warped, it ached, it peeled and sagged and held on. He let the river be his companion, and the birds his music. Nights grew long and unchanging. There were other women, some of them warm, some of them fleeting, none of them her. He did not look for her in their faces. He knew she was not there. Years passed like forgotten songs. Children became teenagers. Teenagers became strangers. Allie's son joined the Navy. Her daughter went north to teach. Lon became a judge, respected and admired, and his hair grayed in a way that made him look more distinguished. Allie learned to host fundraisers and play the piano well enough to charm a room. But some nights, when the house was silent and the lights were off, she would walk into the garden barefoot and stare up at the moon. She would think of the boy who built a house for her and wonder, only faintly, what kind of curtains she might have chosen had she stayed. Noah's mother died one spring, and he buried her near the willow tree behind the barn. After the service, he sat with a man he barely remembered from high school, who had moved away and returned after decades with a limp and a story that didn't end well. They talked of weather, of loss, of what men forget and what they carry. When the man left, Noah stood by the river until dusk, letting the wind braid through his fingers. The house felt heavier after that, as though his mother's spirit had lingered. Uncertain. He began painting again, not like before, not wild sweeps of passion and memory, but quiet things. Boats against fog, branches against snow. A woman once asked if the figure he painted over and over, standing near the edge of a river, was a real person. He said no, but he did not stop painting her. Allie grew older with grace. Wrinkles etched themselves into her skin like stories half told. She held her grandchildren in her lap and told them about France, about dancing, about gardens. She never spoke of the summer she had almost not come back from. Lon fell ill in his 70s, and she nursed him without complaint. When he passed, she felt a silence so complete it hummed. She did not cry much. She simply moved slower. One afternoon, when the leaves were turning gold, Allie drove alone for the first time in months. No destination. Just the road, and the voice in her that had grown quiet but never quite disappeared. She passed through towns that smelled of pine and gasoline, turned corners that she did not remember choosing. She stopped when she saw the house. It was like waking from a dream and realizing the dream was real. She didn't go to the door. She sat in the car for a long time, watching. The paint had faded. The roses had climbed higher than they should. The window shutters hung crooked, and yet it stood, the same way he had. She didn't cry. She simply looked, as if memorizing something she would never see again. Inside, Noah sat by the fire, a cup of tea cooling beside him, a book open on his knees. He did not know she was there. He would never know. She stayed until the sun dipped below the trees, and the shadows stretched like fingers across the lawn. Then she turned the car around and drove away. That night, she painted for the first time. In years, nothing grand. Just a river, and a girl, and the shadow of a house in the background. She left it unfinished. Some stories were better that way. Noah died in the winter. Alone, but not lonely. The house was sold. The paintings boxed and scattered. A neighbor found the sketchbooks and wondered aloud who the woman was in all of them. No one answered. Allie passed a few years later, in her sleep, in a room filled with books and forgotten letters. Her children packed her belongings without much ceremony. In one drawer, her daughter found a worn clipping of a house by a river, folded so many times the creases had nearly consumed it. She kept it without knowing why. The world moved on. Lovers met and parted. Rain fell on roofs, and whispers were exchanged in quiet kitchens. And somewhere, in the soft place between memory and dream, a man waited on a dock, and a girl ran to him barefoot. Not in this life, perhaps, but in the one where the heart never chose safety over fire. The summer after Noah's passing, the house by the river stood empty and humming with memory. Grass grew wild around the porch, and ivy crawled up the beams with slow, deliberate patience. Tourists sometimes passed by on kayaks, pointing to the crumbling white exterior and whispering about the man who built it for a woman who never returned. Some said it was romantic. Others said it was a ghost story. The truth lay somewhere in the quiet creak of the shutters and the faded outline of a woman on canvas, her back always turned, her face never fully formed. It was the truth only time could hold. When Allie's daughter, Margaret, brought the painting home, the one with the river and the girl and the unfinished house. She hung it above her fireplace without quite understanding why. There was something in the way the colors bled into each other, something unspoken and unresolved. Her husband asked who the artist was. She said it had been her mother, once, a long time ago, but she never finished the piece. It was the only one they found in the house that seemed like a message. Margaret's children grew up with that image, always in their periphery. The lonely figure by the water becoming a kind of myth in the family. Her son Daniel once asked if the girl was supposed to be grandma. Margaret paused, smiled softly, and said she wasn't sure. But she never took it down. Years passed, as they always do. The world changed around the house. Cell towers rose on the edges of the forest, and the road was widened to accommodate weekend traffic. A developer bought the land on which the house stood, intending to tear it down and build a lakeside resort. When word reached a local historical society, they petitioned to have the house preserved. They called it a relic of early-century Southern architecture, but the older residents knew it was something else entirely. A monument to a kind of love that had ended before it began again. The fight to preserve it took 2 years, and by the time the ruling passed, the windows were broken, and birds nested in the rafters, but still, it stood. The house became a museum. Eventually, not a grand one. Just a quiet space with creaky floors and laminated plaques. They placed Noah's easel in the corner of what had been his studio, and hung a few of his paintings along the walls. Most were water-damaged, but their soul remained intact. There were no photos of Allie, just one framed letter in a glass box, written by Noah and never sent. Its words were simple and spare. I built it for you. I waited. It's yours. If you want it. Visitors would stop at that case, linger, then move on. The gift shop sold postcards with watercolor renderings of the house. Most people bought them without knowing the story. Some did, and left with a quiet ache they couldn't quite explain. In Charleston, Allie's grave rested beneath a canopy of old oaks. It bore no mention of love lost or stories untold. Just her name, the years that marked her time, and a small inscription that read, "She saw the world through color." Her children visited often at first, then less so, as the years passed and life demanded new attention. But once, decades later, a woman in her 50s, someone who had been a student in Allie's art class, came and laid a single red rose on the headstone. She stayed for over an hour, just sitting beside it, occasionally reaching into her bag for a sketch pad. When she left, she whispered "thank you," and the wind carried the words through the branches like a lullaby. Noah's grave was harder to find. A small stone behind the willow tree on the old property, now part of the museum grounds, with just his name and a carved feather. A boy working maintenance once asked why there was a feather and not a quote or a date. His supervisor shrugged and said it was how he wanted it. The feather became a symbol in local lore. Artists would sometimes leave paintbrushes there. Lovers carved initials into the tree nearby. No one knew him well, but the silence of the space gave people comfort, as if the air itself remembered how to wait. Margaret, now in her 70s, began to write in her final years. She published a memoir that spoke of her mother's gentleness, her discipline, and the many things she never said. In one chapter, she recounted a time she had come home from school and found her mother crying over a letter she had just burned in the fireplace. She had asked what was wrong, and her mother simply kissed her forehead and said, "Sometimes we cry not because we are sad, but because we remember something too beautiful to hold." That line made its way onto the back cover of the book and became quoted in small corners of the internet. In journals, in letters between strangers, a young filmmaker read that memoir and became fascinated with the untold love story behind it. He reached out to Margaret's children and asked permission to make a film not of grand gestures and kisses in the rain, but of silence and time and the love that never became. He filmed in the actual house. He used Noah's real paintings. The movie, titled The River Remains, became a quiet success. Not a blockbuster, but a film that lived in hearts and dorm rooms, and the minds of those who knew what it meant to carry a ghost. In the final scene of the film, a woman stands in front of a house she once knew. She doesn't knock. She doesn't cry. She smiles, faintly, and turns away as the wind lifts the hem of her coat. The camera lingers on the house, on the porch light that flickers as if responding to something unspoken. And then it cuts to black. No music, just the sound of water lapping gently at a distant shore. In a town where the river bends in slow arcs, and trees line the road like sentinels of time. There are still those who pass by the White House and feel something stir. They may not know the names, they may not know the story, but they feel it in the paint that still clings to the wood, in the hush of the willow leaves, in the way the porch groans under the weight of nothing. They feel the love that waited, and the choice that walked away, and somewhere, maybe not in this world, but in the one we carry in dreams, Noah and Allie still meet on that summer lawn, still dance beneath stars, still read to each other from books long forgotten. They live in the place made not of time, but of memory, where choices do not separate and love never fades. But here, in this world of quiet endings and echoing rooms, their story remains what it became. A memory held in brushstrokes and letters unsent. A house that stood through silence, and two hearts that once collided like sparks in the dark, only to drift apart before the fire could catch. The painting above the fireplace in Margaret's home aged more slowly than those around it. Its oils faded, yes, but never into obscurity. If anything, it seemed to grow sharper as the room aged with it. Daniel, now a father himself, had moved the family into Margaret's house after her passing. The space was full of her scent, of her voice and memory, of the dust that held the weight of years. He had grown up staring at that painting, never fully knowing what it meant. His mother used to gaze at it sometimes in the evenings, when she thought no one was watching. He remembered once waking from a nap on the couch and finding her sitting before it in the dark, arms crossed, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. He had not spoken then. He only watched. There was reverence in that moment, and reverence does not ask questions. After her death, Daniel began to go through the attic. He found journals, not diaries, not confessions, but quiet notes, scraps of memory, observations, sketches of flowers and windows. He found a letter too, folded tightly and yellowed with time, addressed simply. For when I'm gone, it was not for him. It was for her, his mother. Allie had written it in her later years, likely after Lon's death, in that same looping cursive that Margaret had imitated for years in school. It wasn't long, just a single page. In it, she described the house. Not the one she had lived in, but the one she hadn't, the White House by the river. She didn't name him, but Daniel knew. The way she described the wraparound porch, the scent of pine, the way the light hid the boards at sunset. And at the end, a single line. We make peace, not by forgetting, but by living gently with the memory. Daniel, unlike his parents, had lived in a different era. One of access, of immediacy, of stories shared and preserved with a tap or a click. He began searching. He found the museum, now closed due to funding issues and decades of wear. He visited the house. It was still there, barely, the roof patched with tarps, the porch leaning into its own shadow. The woman who owned the land, a granddaughter of one of Noah's distant cousins, told him it wasn't worth restoring. Termites, rot, flood risk. But Daniel made an offer. He didn't want to demolish it. He wanted to understand it. It took him a year. He cleaned out the rooms with gloves and a mask, cataloging every brushstroke, every forgotten drawer. He found a small box tucked inside a floorboard behind the fireplace, wrapped in wax cloth and twine. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in Noah's handwriting, but never sent. Most were addressed simply A. Some were angry, some were tender, some simply blank pages, with only the date. There was one, dated exactly 1 year after she had left the Windsor house for good. That read, I thought love would be enough. It wasn't, but I love you still. That's all. That's always. Daniel didn't know why, but he scanned every letter. He digitized the paintings, the house, the sketches of her back turned toward the river, and then, quietly, he built a site. Not commercial, no ads, no merchandise, just stories. The house, the artist, the unnamed muse. He invited people to submit their own untold stories, love that never came back, or did, or almost did. Within months, it had hundreds of entries. Within a year, tens of thousands. The House of Unsent Letters, they called it. And then came the journalists. First, a local publication. Then a human interest segment. Then an international feature about the young man who had restored a forgotten house and uncovered a love story never lived. The world leaned in. Not because the story was grand, but because it was true. Not every love ends in reunion. Some end in silence, in separate lives well lived. And yet they matter. Someone translated the letters. They were published under the title, The Quiet Year. They sold quietly too, but over time, like a river shaping rock, the story endured. A film studio optioned it, this time with Daniel as producer. He demanded it not be dramatized, not romanticized. It would be told exactly as it had happened. No chase at the train station, no last-minute weddings stopped, no miracle reunions. Just two people who loved each other and made different choices, and lived full lives nonetheless. The film was released in winter, years after Margaret's passing, decades after Noah's death. Nearly a century after the summer Allie first stepped into the lumberyard and met a boy who made her laugh. It was sparse, the cinematography lingered on stillness. Critics called it brave in its refusal to offer a tidy ending. Audiences were divided. Some called it devastating. Others, necessary. A quiet revolution against the tyranny of only one kind of love story. In a theater in upstate New York, an old woman watched the film with her granddaughter. She wept silently, and when asked why, she simply said, because once, long ago, I made a different choice to dot in Charleston. Daniel's own daughter, now 13, began painting, not landscapes, but figures. Faces turned away, hands reaching but not touching. When asked where she learned to paint like that, she said, I think it runs in the family. She never met Allie. She barely remembered Margaret. But something passed down, not in blood, maybe, but in the quiet ways we carry those who came before. In the house by the river, now maintained by a trust funded by visitors and readers alike, there was a new plaque beside the old fireplace. It bore a quote from one of Noah's last letters, not a grand declaration, but a whisper, love, even left behind, never really goes. Visitors often sat in the rocking chair by the window and stared out at the river. Sometimes they wrote letters of their own. A drawer in the museum desk was always full of folded papers, confessions written by trembling hands. No one read them. That was the rule. But they stayed there, kept safe. Because sometimes, it's not about the letter being sent. It's about it being written at all. When Daniel died in his 80s, they buried him beside the house. Not behind it, not near the tree, but under the porch. Beneath the floorboards where his grandfather had once hidden his grief. His tombstone bore no names but his own. But in the corner, etched small, was a painted feather. The house remains. Breathes with the breath of those who once danced in its kitchen, who once painted by its windows, who once waited on its dock, and in the silence of its empty rooms, in the dust caught in sunlight, in the walls that still creak with memory. Their story lives on. Not as tragedy, not as romance, but as something deeper, as proof that love, even when it doesn't last, still changes everything, even the things it never touched directly, even the future, even us. The house by the river stood still, but the world kept moving. In the decades that followed Daniel's death, the property passed into the care of his granddaughter, Emma. She was in her mid-30s when the trust was transferred to her name, a quiet woman with dark curls and a subtle way of seeing beauty where others saw only dust. She was not a historian by trade. She had studied biology and spent the early years of her adulthood in rainforest field stations and remote archipelagos. But when her father died and left her the deed, she came home. At first, she only meant to stay a month. She told herself she would sort the paperwork, make the donations, wind things down gently. But on her first night sleeping in the upstairs room, the one they believed had once been Allie's, though no one could be sure, she dreamt of river water. Not drowning, floating, not cold. Warm and slow, like memory. When she woke, the air smelled of linseed oil and pine. She walked through the house barefoot that morning, letting the boards creak beneath her as they always had. The museum had closed to the public after Daniel's passing, but she kept it intact. The letters remained, preserved now in a controlled archive room Emma had personally sealed. The desk drawer still held anonymous notes from those who came over the years, though now only a few visited each month. Quiet people, careful people, people who knew they weren't there to be entertained but to remember. Emma began keeping a log, not of visitors, but of feelings, of what the light looked like each morning in the parlor, of the silence at 3 a.m., and how it felt heavier than the dark. She wrote pages about the way the wallpaper peeled in waves, like it was trying to return to the forest, and when she finally picked up a brush again, not since her mother had died, she did not paint the house, or the river, or any people. She painted absence. An empty chair, a crumpled letter, a door slightly ajar. Those paintings gained attention after she posted one, without context, on a quiet art blog. It went viral in a strange, subdued way. Not mass hysteria, just slow blooming, reposts, thoughtful comments. People saying, "I've felt this, but I've never seen it." She didn't sign them. She never explained. She only posted more. Then came a gallery offer, then a show, then another. People wanted to know who she was, where the ache came from. She gave no interviews. She said little. The critics began referring to her style as emotive, minimalism, but those who truly understood saw more. They saw Noah's hands in the brushstrokes, Allie's silence in the negative space, generations of almosts and never was. Wrapped in oil and linen. Emma bought back the adjacent lots the museum had sold off during lean years. She planted a wildflower field where the gift shop once stood. She cleared the riverbank of invasive plants and rebuilt the old dock. And every Saturday at dusk, she sat at the end of it, legs swinging over the edge, watching the current. She never expected anyone to join her. But once, a boy of maybe 11 came and sat beside her without a word. They stayed there for nearly an hour before he said, "My mum says this place was built for someone who never came back." Emma nodded. "Some people don't have to come back," she said. "They're already here." When he left, he handed her a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing. A girl with her back turned, standing on a porch. Above her, the words, "Maybe she was never supposed to come in. Maybe the house was her home from the outside." Emma placed it in the desk drawer. Years passed. The world frayed. Further at the edges. Cities rose higher. Seas crept inward. People fled screens for something real again. The house became sacred. Not in a religious sense, but in a human one. Those who visited came not to be told what happened, but to feel what had almost been. It became pilgrimage, in the softest way. Emma never married. She had lovers, friends, a tribe of artists and thinkers and quiet souls who passed through her life like wind through trees. But her anchor remained the house. She lived and died there. Her final years spent in the same upstairs room where Allie might have stood, with trembling hands and indecision in her lungs. When she passed, her will was specific. No embalming, no headstone. Bury me under the field, and let the wildflowers forget me, and so they did. A group of local caretakers, some of whom had worked on the grounds for years, some of whom had only come recently, preserved the house in her honor, but not as a museum. Not anymore. It became something new. They called it the Quiet School, a retreat for artists and writers and wanderers who had something to say but no words to say it with. Each guest stayed 1 week. No phones, no clocks, no mirrors. On the final day of their stay, they left something behind. A painting, a poem, a carved spoon, a braid of hair, a breath. The house collected these things not as a hoarder, but as a bearer of meaning. The walls became full of echoes. The porch held the weight of stories that had no titles. In one of the closets, someone had placed a notebook with the words, "What we don't say still exists." And in a box, somewhere near the attic, someone had left a question. Would they have been happy? No one ever answered, because that wasn't the point. They had loved. And that love, even in silence, had moved the world. It had rippled down through time, not as a storm, but as a tide, slow, steady, reshaping the shoreline long after the moon moved on. And maybe, somewhere beyond names and dates, and lives lived in other ways, Noah and Allie stood at the river's edge once more, not as ghosts, not as regrets, but as something eternal, as memory, as inspiration, as proof that love does not always need a future to be real. Somewhere, a young girl stands in a gallery, staring at a painting of an empty room and a single red leaf on the floor. She doesn't know the story, but she feels it. She breathes in the silence and exhales something she can't name. She turns to her mother and says, "I don't know why, but I feel like I've been here before." And that is how it lives on. Not in books, not in museums, in the spaces we don't talk about, in the choices we almost made, in the houses we never entered. In the people we never touched but somehow still shaped. And in the knowledge that love, even once, even if, can last longer than time itself. By the time the 100th anniversary of the house approached, the world had changed beyond the shapes Noah or Allie could have recognized. The river still flowed, though now part of a protected ecological corridor stretching across multiple states. The old roads leading to the property were long closed to commercial traffic, and the nearest town had shifted further inland to accommodate the rising tides. But the house remained, maintained now not by a single caretaker or family trust, but by a collective of artists, historians, and preservationists from around the world. They did not live there, no one did. The house was sacred ground. In a quiet chamber once used as a pantry, a holographic archive flickered softly against the original wooden walls. It displayed not images of Allie and Noah, for there were few that survived, but the art they inspired, paintings, sculptures, even fragments of dance pieces and sound installations, all curated into a slow, shifting exhibition that rotated through the contributions of thousands over the years. Visitors did not come for selfies. They came to sit on the porch at sunrise and feel the hush. A tradition had formed. Every 10 years, on the night of the summer solstice, a vigil was held, not in mourning, not in celebration, but in reverent silence. People traveled from across oceans to attend. They brought tokens, not gifts or offerings, but remnants of their own stories. A folded scarf, a burned letter, a half-finished song scribbled on torn paper. These objects were not catalogued or displayed. They were stored in the attic, layered into time like tree rings. No one ever took inventory. No one needed to. The collection was felt, not seen. One year, a novelist who had long idolized the story, not as romance, but as art, arrived unannounced and asked to stay a week in silence. She left behind a single book, handwritten, leather-bound, and untitled inside, a single sentence repeated across all 312 pages. "I loved someone I never met." When asked what it meant, she simply said, "That's the closest I've ever come to peace." In another instance, a widower nearing 90 left a pressed daisy between the floorboards in the hallway. He had proposed to his wife there, decades earlier. During a writing retreat, she had died 2 years later. Every year since, he had returned. This time, he didn't say goodbye. He simply tucked the flower beneath the old pine planks and whispered, "I'm finally ready." When the house creaked in response, no one questioned it. Over time, the names Noah and Allie became symbols more than people. The guides no longer told their story as a linear narrative, but as a phenomenon. Some versions said she came back for a day and then disappeared. Others believed she had watched him from the road until he died. Some claimed they had met again in dreams, walking hand in hand through a house that only existed in memory, but no story was ever confirmed. And the ambiguity became the point. Emma's paintings now hung in museums around the world. Her most iconic piece, titled The Back Turned, had become a subject of scholarly obsession. It depicted a woman in a blue dress standing before an open doorway, her head slightly bowed, her hand resting on the frame. The room behind her was lit with impossible light, golden, mournful, eternal. That painting alone had inspired 4 doctoral theses, 2 ballets, and 1,000 pages of online essays. Emma never commented on its meaning. She simply said, "It came through me, not from me." In an international art conference, a speaker once said, "The house is not a building. The house is the unchosen path. It is the room we glimpse when we walk away. And yet, through walking away, we carry it with us." Meanwhile, at the property, a group of caretakers implemented a policy known only as the quiet morning. From 5 to 9 every dawn, no one was allowed to speak, write, record, or interfere. Those hours belonged to the past. Visitors were invited to simply walk the grounds, sit in the rooms, breathe. A child, visiting with their parents during one such morning, was seen sitting cross-legged in the hallway, humming softly to herself as light streamed in through a stained glass. When Doan asked later what she'd been thinking, she said, "I was listening for the people who used to live here. They don't talk like we do, but they still live here, I think." A small corner of the property was converted into an open library. The books were not for borrowing, only for reading on site. Most were handmade, filled with stories left behind by guests. Some were fictional, some autobiographical, many anonymous. One thin journal bore no text, but only line after line of vertical brushstrokes, each in a different shade of blue. It was titled simply, "The Distance Between Us." There were those who criticized the mythologizing, who argued that to preserve a love story that had never fulfilled itself was to glorify heartbreak. But they missed the point. The house did not celebrate loss. It honored the decision, the aching, complex decision, to live a different life than the one you once imagined. It asked not for pity or judgment, but for recognition. Noah had built the house not to win her back, but to make something beautiful from what had been left behind. Allie had walked away not because she lacked feeling, but because she believed. Her love was not strong enough to carry the weight of forever. And somehow, in the space between those truths, something transcendent had grown. In one of the final letters Noah had written, discovered long after the archives were first organized, he had scribbled a note in the margin. The line had never been quoted, never been published. But those who worked closely with the original materials knew it by heart. It read, "We did not end. We scattered. And in scattering, we seeded something that has no name." By the 150th anniversary of the house, only the stone foundations and chimney remained. A fire, believed to be caused by lightning, had destroyed most of the structure. Nothing else on the property burned, only the house. The community grieved not because the house was gone, but because it had finally finished its work. They held a wake, not a funeral. The difference mattered. People danced barefoot in the wildflower field. They sang old folk songs, wrote new ones. Someone read aloud the very first letter Noah had written after Allie left. Another person responded with one of Allie's journal entries, found in the Windsor attic decades after her death. And when the moon rose over the now empty field, someone strung up a single length of linen between 2 trees. On it, projected softly and without sound, was a painting of a girl in a summer dress, standing in front of a house with peeling paint. She did not knock. She did not enter. She simply looked. And the light caught her hair in such a way that the audience could not be sure whether she was smiling or crying. In the centuries that followed, people would forget the exact coordinates. The names would fade from curricula. But in art schools, in songs hummed to babies, in bedtime stories and whispered prayers, the story endured, of a girl who chose one life and a boy who built another, of a house that waited, not in bitterness, but in peace, of a love that scattered, and in scattering, grew, and of how sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones where people end up together, but the ones where they don't, and still, somehow, never leave each other. long after the foundations of the house had collapsed into the earth and the chimney had weathered down into mossy ruin. The place was still remembered. Not as a location on a map, not as a destination with brochures or plaques, but as a kind of shared dream passed along in fragments, like old stories told by firelight. The house had become something else, a metaphor, a spirit, a hush that lived in the pause before a decision, in the sigh just after a parting. No one alive now had seen it standing, but still, they spoke of it. The field, where the house once stood, had been left untouched for generations, declared a protected memory site by a global heritage council. But no barriers were built, no gates or signs erected. Instead, travelers found it by intuition. A narrow footpath cut through the dense woods and eventually opened into a clearing of tall golden grass and soft hills. The air was different there, softer, heavier, somehow, with meaning. People came without knowing why. They brought no cameras, they left no trash. They walked barefoot and whispered to one another. Some claimed to feel heat from the place where the hearth had once stood. Others reported the faint scent of pine, or paint, or river water on the breeze. Some sat in silence for hours, staring at what looked like nothing. But they always left changed. Something inside them shifted, not dramatically, but gently. Like a book placed on the correct shelf after years of being out of order. The legacy of Noah and Allie had become untethered from specifics. Their names were rarely spoken now, had become symbols, yes, but more than that. They had become a language. The language of what if, of almost, of the still-burning echo that lives in every life not lived. Artists still painted the girl in the blue dress. Writers still wrote about the house that waited, but no two versions were ever the same. Each person found their own story inside it. In one version, the girl returned, but chose to stand outside, watching as the boy inside read by firelight, never knowing she was there. In another, they met again in old age on a train, said nothing, only held hands until the station came. In some, they were reincarnated as strangers who passed on the street every day, feeling something tugged at their hearts without knowing why. And in all of them, the love remained, not triumphant, not tragic, but wholly in its incompletion. Centuries passed. The world changed again and again. Languages shifted, borders blurred. The river still ran, though slower now, its course slightly altered by erosion and climate and time. A grove of willows grew in the field, circling the place where the house had once stood. It was said that the trees bent inward, not because of wind, but because they remembered. No one harvested from that grove. No one disturbed the soil. It was a place of reverence, of quiet. A new people came generations beyond memory, without written record of what had been. They found the grove, built no structures there, but gathered once a year in silence. They did not know why, only that the place called for stillness. They did not know the story of the house, only that something had happened there, something sacred and unresolved. Eventually, even the stories faded from books. The language changed so drastically that nothing remained of the names, the dates, the places, but the feeling endured. And in a world that now remembered so little of what had come before, that feeling became its own religion. Not organized, not codified, just a practice of holding space for what never was, and honoring it as deeply as what came to be. In one final telling, passed through centuries of voices, and eventually transcribed in a tongue far removed from our own, there is a single phrase carved into a stone beneath the willows. The phrase has no direct translation, but scholars have approximated it as, "We lived beside the lives we might have lived, and in doing so, loved more fully than we ever could have within them." And that, perhaps, is the end of the story. Or maybe, just its truest beginning. Because some love stories do not end with reunion. Some love stories do not end with parting. Some love stories do not end at all. They only continue. In the quiet breath before a decision, in the long walk back to a place that only ever existed in the heart, and in the pause between two strangers who look at each other and feel, somewhere deep and unexplainable, that they've met before. Not in this world, maybe, but in one built of memory and hope. And in that world, the door never quite closes. The house never truly falls. The river keeps running, and the girl always turns back one last time before she walks away. Not because she regrets her choice, but because she wants to remember. Because remembering is a kind of love to dot, and sometimes it's the only kind that lasts forever. In the seasons that followed, the collapse of the old house and the grove's quiet rise in its place, there came a woman named Kalia, a scholar of forgotten places. She had traveled the world to study ruins and their surrounding legends. But it wasn't bricks and artifacts that interested her. It was what people carried away from them, the echoes, the soft impressions left in the heart long after the structure was gone. She had heard of the Willow Grove from an old oral map passed down in what was left of a coastal tribe's memory. The path was marked only by silence, and the grove itself by a certain light in the morning, pale and shimmering, like the breath before a name. She made her way alone, with no digital aid, trusting only in stories told by firelight and the slight bends of moss on stone. When she reached the grove, she did not enter. She set her pack down at the edge of the clearing, and watched the way the wind moved differently there, slower, as though even time bowed in respect. Kalia was not spiritual by nature, but she recognized reverence when she saw it. The trees did not whisper. They listened. That night she dreamt of paint on her fingertips, and of hands that trembled not from age but from decision. She woke with tears already slipping down her cheek and the taste of river water in her mouth. She stayed for 3 days, marking nothing, documenting nothing. She merely sat. When she left, she took nothing with her, only the certainty that some stories were never meant to be owned, only known. Years later, her writing on invisible inheritance referenced the grove only once, in a footnote that read, "Some places do not record history, they feel it." Kalia's quiet mention sparked curiosity in a younger generation of artists and seekers, those disillusioned by the polished epics and polished myths of their time. They sought stories with edges still raw, love without resolution, beauty that left bruises. The idea of the grove spread through whispered conversations and encoded language in zines and spoken word poems. It became, once more, a pilgrimage. Not for answers, for presence. A group of 4 arrived one spring. Mira, a weaver who wove tapestries of breathless absence. Jules, a poet who only wrote in ink made of crushed petals and ash. Tavi, a silent sculptor whose pieces always depicted 2 figures leaning away from each other. And Rowan, a former physicist turned archivist of emotional frequencies. None of them knew the others before their arrival. They did not speak when they met. They nodded and understood that each had been called by something that had no language. They camped at the grove's edge for 9 days. On the 10th they entered, not together, but as 4 separate shadows, moving toward a shared center. Mira left behind a length of woven fabric, too delicate to be touched, suspended between 2 bent branches. Jules recited a single poem into the bark of the oldest tree. Tavi buried a sculpture so small it could fit in the palm, sealed in clay to be broken only by time. Rowan tuned a glass chime to the hum of the grove's wind, and left it hanging near the site where the house's front steps once rested. They left without speaking, without taking photographs, without telling others what they had done. But the grove remembered, and over time, as the world continued its slow spin, toward a future where data replaced memory and connection, was measured in velocity, rather than depth. There were still those who came to the grove to slow down. A girl escaping a life chosen for her. A man who had loved someone he never dared speak to. A pair of lovers who agreed, wordlessly, to walk separate paths after holding each other for the last time. They all left something behind. Not always physical, but real. It was during the Age of Restoration, when the planet's systems were slowly recalibrating after years of imbalance, that a child named Ian wandered into the grove. He had been born with no spoken language, a quiet mind that heard music in everything. His parents, researchers from a floating city built over the remains of a sunken port, brought him to the grove after reading a fragment from Kalia's field notes, preserved in an emotional archive. They hoped something might reach him there. He walked into the grove alone, sat beneath a willow that leaned as though listening. And for the first time, he made a sound, not a word, but a humming that vibrated through his chest, matching perfectly the wind as it moved through the trees. His parents, watching from afar, wept openly. It was not speech. It was not a cure. But it was belonging. Ian grew into a kind of healer. Not with medicine, but with presence. He built sanctuaries designed not to fix people, but to hold them while they unraveled. He credited the grove, though he never returned. He said, "I think I'm still there, somewhere, and if I go back, I might vanish entirely." In the final chapter of his memoir, he wrote of a love story he never fully understood, passed down through incomplete symbols and fading memories. He called it The House That Waited, and in it, he described a woman in a summer dress, walking past a man with paint-stained hands, neither turning toward the other, both trembling as they passed. The story ended not with grief or regret, but with a line that echoed through time. Some love stories do not begin, but they never end. And so the grove remained. Its trees twisting higher into the sky, its silence deepening into something holy. The world shifted again. New languages formed. Technology fell and rose again. But always, there were the pilgrims. The whisperers. The ones who needed to remember something they could never name. And the grove, once a house, once a memory, once a wound, held them all. The grove endured the way old oceans endure, not by resisting change, but by absorbing it, letting it pass through and settle. Seasons shifted with gentler hands now. Human presence on the earth had lessened, not from collapse, but from understanding. The age of retreat had come not in flames, but in soft rebalancing. Cities were fewer, built vertically rather than outward, and much of the land had been given back to silence. The grove, no longer marked on maps or spoken of in public record, existed now in the oral canon of the wandering archivists, a movement of memory keepers who traveled without name or hierarchy. They wore no uniforms, carried no devices, spoke rarely. They were chosen not by committee but by feeling. Each carried a personal record, a woven scroll of memory fragments encoded, not in text but in pressure, scent, and heat. When one archivist met another, they would sit in stillness and share without speech. A pulse passed between hands. A story lived for a moment. Then they would part. Among these archivists was a figure known only as Kara. No one knew her origin. It was said she had been born in a northern cradle during a thunderstorm that split the sky without sound. Her record was unlike any other, made of thin stone strips, worn smooth by time, layered like bone. Her memories were sharp but sorrowful. She carried the impression of an old house, long vanished, and a pair of lovers who had never touched hands after youth. But she did not mourn. She walked the earth in peace, finding pieces of their echo in the unlikeliest places. One night, on the edge of the former continent, once called Carolina, Kara arrived at a cluster of ruins, reclaimed by nature. The trees had long since swallowed any trace of construction, but beneath her feet, the earth pulsed with familiarity. She sat cross-legged and placed her palm on the ground. The silence responded. It was not empty. It was full of breath. She stayed there for 3 days, eating only berries and rain. On the 4th, a group of children from a coastal settlement found her, and watched from a distance, whispering. They had never seen someone so still. She opened her eyes and beckoned them near. They came cautious, curious. She did not speak. She simply lifted one of the smooth stone strips from her record, and placed it gently in the hands of the smallest child, who pressed her forehead against it instinctively. A hush fell over them. The memory that came was not a vision, but a sensation, the warmth of a hand once held, and then let go. A doorway never entered. The sound of a rocking chair, an empty room. The girl wept softly, not from sadness, from knowing something deeply human had occurred before her, and that she, somehow, carried a piece of it. That moment began a new rhythm in their lives. The children came each season to sit in silence with Kara. She never told them what the grove had been. They never asked. They didn't need to. They understood it in their bones. They built no monuments, no temples. But they began placing small, carved tokens in the soil. Little arches, tiny bridges, open doorways. None more than a few inches tall. They called them the almosts. It became a rite of passage in their settlement, to carve an almost on your 13th winter, and place it where the wind felt oldest. Decades passed. Kara did not age as others did. Or perhaps she did, but gently, the way stone ages, without breaking. One season, she stopped waking. The children, now grown, buried her in the grove, without ceremony, placing her record among the roots of the willow that leaned farthest east. No marker, only the impression of her hands in the soil, and the faint warmth the ground kept long after her body had gone cold. That same year, a poet living in one of the distant sky cities published a collection titled, What We Never Said. It contained no words, only textured paper, punctured in faint patterns that released scent when touched. The title page bore a symbol of a house beneath a crescent moon. The poet gave no interviews. When asked what the work meant, she answered, "It means I still feel them, even if I don't know who they are." Elsewhere, a composer designed a piece, made entirely from silence and resonance. Audience members sat inside a chamber of cedar wood, while small vibrations passed through the floor and walls. No music played, but afterward, many claimed to remember someone they had not thought of in years, a teacher, a stranger on a train, a love that had ended in a hallway with a single breath. That peace was named River Between. And still, in places untouched by foot or voice, the memory moved. In the dreams of children, in the moments before decisions, in the way someone might pause at a crossroad and, for no apparent reason, turn away from the path they had planned and walk another, not because it was safer or easier, but because it felt somehow right, as though someone long before had stood in that very place and made a different choice. Love, it turns out, does not need witnesses. Love does not need completion. Love needs only presence, a gaze, a decision, a silence filled with meaning. And so, the story of Allie and Noah, of the house built for a girl who never returned, of the girl who carried that house in her heart, though she never stepped inside, became a kind of bloodline in the human soul, a strand of emotion passed down not through DNA, but through gesture, memory. 1,000 years after the grove first rose from the ashes of that house, a traveler arrived at the clearing, where nothing but wind remained. They brought no offering, no questions, no burden, only themselves. They stood in the middle of the grass and closed their eyes. And in that space, the air shifted. They could not name it, but they felt it. A hand reaching a hand letting go. And the hush that follows when neither says a word,